I was told this story in the early 1980s by a park ranger. I will repeat it to the best of my recollection. I live in eastern Washington, just about an hour from where the Paul Freeman video was actually made. In the early 80s, I was elk hunting just a few miles from the Mill Creek watershed, and by chance bumped into a ranger along the road whose job it was to patrol the watershed. The watershed is several thousand mountainous acres with heavy timber and very steep ridges. All of it is off limits to the public because it provides drinking water to the city of Walla Walla. We began talking about Paul Freeman, and eventually I asked him if he had ever seen a Bigfoot. He said, "No, but I did have an interesting experience." He told me that one day in the wintertime, he was driving up the mountain alongside the watershed perimeter on the Washington side. Part of the watershed is in Oregon, part Washington. It was snowing, and as he climbed up the mountain, the snow got deeper, and eventually, he was driving through fresh snow with no vehicle tracks in it other than his own. He continued on for some distance before parking the vehicle and deciding to do some walking along the watershed boundary. Apparently, it was here, all alone in a snowstorm, that he ran across fresh Bigfoot tracks down a steep trail and leading into the watershed. No vehicles in the area, no sign of people, no chance of anybody seeing the tracks, and yet there they were. I do not know the name of the ranger, and that I was in my 20s. He looked like 40s, so I'm sure he's long retired. I will also add that he was somewhat skeptical of the whole Bigfoot idea, but he could not give an explanation for the life of him for the tracks. He had absolutely no reason to lie or exaggerate, and even to this day, I 100% believe his story. Not exactly a park ranger story, but it does involve a park ranger. It's the scariest story that I have, and I was camping in northern Michigan with my dad. My grandma lived on a lake and a house near Gaylord, Michigan, which my parents and I would frequent every Friday through Sunday for well over a decade, until my grandmother sold the place. Our routine would be to pack up all necessary equipment for a 3-day camping trip, fit it into our trucks, grab the mountain bikes, and head off to one of the state forests. We then would find a random 2-track leading into the woods. Particularly, we always aimed for those that looked like they haven't been driven on in years due to overgrowth. Find a place to park, offload bikes, and leave. Generally, made our own trail when we could. The goal was to find a stream or river and set up camp in any clearing we could find. Usually, ended up just in a clearing, as we never went more than 10 to 15 miles from the truck. One time, we actually came across an old fountain of what I'm assuming was once an old home. No trail or road remotely near for miles, right on a stream, made of rocks about the size of a brick. There was a small wooden shack, I don't know, maybe 10 or so feet from the foundation, maybe 4 or 4.5 feet tall. I remember my dad had to bend over, and I just hunched, I was a kid, to get inside. Inside were rusted out gun barrels galore, fishing poles, snowshoes, bedding, old pots and pans. Clearly, the area hadn't been used in a very long time. Just cool stuff for a 12-year-old kid. We set up camp about 20 feet away, caught a few bullfrogs and cooked them up for dinner, along with some pan-fried nachos on the small Coleman that we had. You know, with those old-school mini propane tanks. No light pollution. The night sky was amazing. You could see so many stars. To this day, my favorite part about camping is after dark. That night, shortly before we went to bed, we tied up all of our food and hung it up about 15 or so feet in the air, over a branch, like you see in the movies. It keeps bears and other animals out of it essentially. Our normal nightly routine. Shortly after we zipper the tent up to get some sleep, we started hearing grunting and huffing sounds coming from across the creek. Dad, being an avid hunter, says it's likely a deer or elk, maybe a bear, which we have seen all these and more on our trips. Sound does carry pretty far, so Dad wasn't too concerned. We hear it throughout the night, but the sounds began getting almost baby-like. The only way I can describe it is imagine a baby whining softly. Add this with very deep huffs and grunting. Periodically, we would hear a high-pitched, sharp but very short cry. Sounded to me like a baby screaming. Just creepy. Throughout the night, these sounds come and go. Dad loaded the Remington, and I had my little 20-gauge small game ready to go, just in case. My first gun, and my first time taking it with us on one of our trips. We eventually fell asleep. We wake up to nothing too out of the ordinary, except a stench of rotting meat, like a dead animal. We figured an animal had died, and we just could smell it on the wind. We would come across coyote kills sometimes, or some other animals, so we really didn't think anything of it. We go outside to a beautiful sunrise, and the sound of flies. Dad just figured we lost the food, and the flies are on it now. Dad walks around back by the food bag, and stops abruptly, and just says, I still remember it very slowly, a what the. Behind our tent are 3 deer, strung up, skinned and gutted. The deer were hung on 3 different branches on the same tree our bag was on, which was untouched. Each head was cut off and set on top of the guts. Each head was pointed directly at our tent. No one around. No footprints. No blood trail. Nothing. Just 3 deer hanging by a vine. No twine or rope. Vines. Dad grabbed the gun and went to try and spot tracks or blood. By the way, he is a phenomenal tracker and has been a guide on a few occasions for experience hunts in the Upper Peninsula. He found nothing. We heard nothing in the night either. Incredibly creepy and disturbing. I was spooked. Dad was spooked too. As we packed up that Saturday and headed back to the truck. No incidents on the way back. Just a normal half-day trip back to the truck. Drove to DNR station and reported it. I just remember the guy looking at me, then my dad, shaking his head slowly and picking up the phone to call whoever. All we heard him say was something like, another skinned animal sighting near the whatever stream. Clearly, it had happened before, but what is going on? Dad never did find out if it was somebody or something. The fact that my dad couldn't find any blood spotting or trails where those deer would have been dragged, or hoof prints where they were perhaps walked. Back in the early 2000s, for a few years, I worked in the forest industry. Much of that time involved me patrolling around my designated area as a park ranger. And although most days were mundane and boring, and did not have anything exciting or worthwhile mentioning, there was a stretch of days that still deeply disturbed me. I was in an area where there are no reported bears, wolves, and hardly any cougars or mountain lions, which means that we have an abundance of deer and other wild game. This was in like 2002 or 3, so I don't know if that's changed since. But at the time, there was a lot of deer in the area. Then, one day, as if something radically changed overnight, I found at least 9 different deer corpses in just a short area, all within about a 2.5-mile perimeter of each other. Here's the problem. These weren't just dead deer. They were shredded apart. I'm talking ripped from limb to limb, as if something grabbed them by the two front legs and ripped them down the middle. Sometimes their spines would still be attached. Other times, it looked like something had beat them against a tree, torn their legs off, and grabbed their bodies and squeezed them till their organs popped out, or flat out just grabbed their skin and ripped them open. None of them looked like they died peacefully or pain-free. This went on for a series of about 3 or 4 days, and it deeply disturbed me. The first day, I found the 9. The second day, I found about 2 or 3. And the last day, I found about another 4. All does, no bucks. All having died in gruesome, horrible ways. I saw no evidence or traces of anyone, like a poacher or hunter, coming through the area. And I also saw no traces or tracks of any large mountain lion, cat, or anything. Besides, a hunter or a cougar does not kill this way, nor would they leave the meat or any of the body that way. These deer weren't even eaten on, just brutally killed, gutted, and torn apart, and then left there. All very fresh kills. I worked during the daytime, and it was evident that each day I would find these, the kills had to have been no older than 12 hours old. The other weird thing was, too, flies weren't even buzzing around these corpses. That's very unusual, especially for being at least 12 hours old. They were even hardly decaying. I still wonder to this day what came through and tore up all those deer, and why. If it was a person, what's the point? Why didn't they harvest any of the meat? Why did they degut it and just leave it? And if it was a cougar, why did it kill in such a way that was so destructive? So alien from any way that a cougar normally kills a deer. And of course, why didn't it eat any of the meat? I don't even believe this was a territory kill either. My guess is that all these deer were just suddenly attacked and killed. It doesn't appear as if they ran and hid. It's like they were just attacked and killed on the spot they were standing. I found a couple of them dead by a small stream nearby, as if they were drinking when they were attacked and slaughtered. There also wasn't a lot of blood, while there was a considerable amount of blood in each of the spots where they died, even though their death proved that they were thrown around or torn up. There wasn't a lot of gore or blood really anywhere in like a 6-foot radius from their corpse. It was all very contained, furthering the theory that they were killed and torn apart in that exact small spot. One of the strangest things I've ever seen, as well as creepy and disturbing. This job isn't for everybody. In 2004, I took on a new career, although my career change actually had nothing to do with that series of days that I'm telling you about. It was actually due to moving and wanting to pursue a different path in life. I have to confess, I'm not sure what the creature was, but I can tell you it wasn't a bear. Here's my story. You decide. I'm watching a YouTube video just the other day, and it reminded me of when I was up in Western Virginia, a beautiful part of the country. Appalachian Trail passes very near the Roanoke and Craig County line. Just over in Craig County is the spot where Audie Murphy's plane went down and he was killed. I've hiked up to the site and seen the monument that marks the site now. This was back in the mid-90s. I had a friend who worked as a volunteer with the Craig County Emergency Services give me a call one evening. He explained they were organizing a search for a couple of hikers that were last reported going off trail to see the memorial. They're overdue, and nobody has seen them. I never could say no to helping search for somebody who's lost. Someday, someone might be looking for me. It's a karma thing. Next morning, I get myself all geared up and out the door. It's a Saturday, and I drive to where he told me to meet up with them. We hook up, and while I'm about 20 years younger then, and I sort of make a visual survey around me, I think I've managed to count the other people my age who were there on the fingers of one hand, and darned if I didn't have any fingers left over. There were several county officers there. However, all but one of them didn't look like they could walk more than a couple of 100 yards. Sadly, too many stops at the donut shop. Now, let me say this. I don't mean any disrespect to law enforcement. No, not at all. Most police keep themselves in great shape nowadays, however. This is a little small county that doesn't pay much, and they sort of have to take what they can get, if you get what I'm saying. Can't have too many physical requirements, or they might not have any law enforcement. The rest, I swear, are 20-somethings, and about a quarter of them look like they should still be in high school. So I'm talking to Jimmy, and he says we're about to be briefed by the chief. Sure enough, as he finished saying the words, "the chief," he comes out, and I almost snickered. The chief was the fire chief of the county, and when it came to search and rescue, he was the county coordinator. What I thought was funny was he was wearing a huge white fireman's ceremonial hat that had "chief" on it in huge letters. This was mainly due to the fire department having the best communication system in the county, even better than the 911. So, we form up in front of a large-scale map of the county. He points to it, gives us a rundown of what they know. Then, he sets about making up groups, as he didn't want anyone going off alone. He puts me in a group with young guys. The first thing going through my mind was, oh great, I'm a babysitter. So the chief is going around, giving various group area assignments, getting the names and addresses of everybody involved. He gets over to my group. We already have our information written down. He takes out his smaller map, assigns us an area. I have my map pouch with me, and I take out the map for the area he's assigned us, and I start marking it off my map. Then he says to me, "You have your own maps?" And I told him, "Well, yeah." "You got a compass?" he said. "Yeah, and my truck with my gear." "Gear? You have your own gear?" I was a little surprised. I said, "Yeah." And then I told him, "Chief, this area you've given us to search will take the better part of the day, and that's assuming we don't have anything that happens to slow us down." He sort of smiled and asked what my background was. I told him I'm an engineer. He looked at me a little closer, like he was sizing up a horse he was going to buy. Told me, "Engineer, huh? Not much engineering out here." Asked me what kind of experience I had tracking. I almost asked him, "Is this an interview?" And he told me he does a lot of hunting. I wasn't going to say Bigfoot, because I was pretty sure this old boy would have run me off as crazy. "And I do a lot of trail hiking," I told him. I watched his eyes lit up. "You do, huh?" And so I nodded. "Take a good look at your map, and tell me what you think these fellows might have done." I looked at the map for a bit and said, "Well, we're last seen about here, which is where the parking lot is located. My guess is they probably made a straight course toward the monument, and most likely they used the trail to hike up the monument." So then he asked me, "You think they would have gone back the same way?" I looked at him and told him nope. Hikers don't like looking at the same things more than once, as a general rule. My guess is the monument was just a jumping off point for them. Then he smiled at me and said, "That's the way I figured too." Then I offered up. That part of Craig County is pretty remote. Heck, I mean, if it wasn't for old Audie Murphy getting himself killed out there, the odds are hardly anyone would be there. And then I paused. "Chief, I know you've already thought about this, but how about shiners and pot growers? If those boys ran afoul of any of them, I'd bet we'll never find them." And so he looked at me. "You think like I do, but according to the police chief, they don't have any activity in those areas because, while they're remote, it's no easy way to get supplies in there. You gotta have sugar, you gotta have corn, and you gotta have water. Not much of those in that area. And to make any money growing pot, you need fewer trees or the plants won't get sunlight." In about an hour, we all had our assignments and teams, so we drove down to the parking lot at the monument. It was a gravel road, as there was little traffic, and we all got out and started getting our gear together, and in just a few minutes, I was ready. Unfortunately, The other team members wanted to continue to talk to their buddies. The one guy with the radio, myself and 2 young fellows were ready. I looked over at them and said, "Okay guys, we're out of here." They looked at me like I was speaking another language. They had a surprised look on their faces and said, "Oh, we're not going back to the station." Now I had the odd look. Why would we be doing that? Then the one said, "Because all our gear is back there." And so I looked at the other. "Yours too?" He just nodded with a dumbfounded look. I thought to myself, "Oh geez. Well, you two go get your gear and get another assignment, because we don't have time to wait." Then the one guy said, "We didn't know this was taking us to where to look." So I looked at him and said, "No problem. Just get another assignment after you get your gear. I'm sure the chief will have plenty." And then they looked at each other, and then back at the friends they were paying so much attention to, and just laughed and shrugged. Then he turned back and said, "Well, all we really need is water, and you got plenty of that." I cut him off. "I don't carry water for others, nor do I carry gear for anyone but me. We have an assignment. Same one who you were supposed to have, only you didn't bring your gear." With that, I turned and said, "Come on." There seems to be some in every crowd who thinks that this is just some game, and they don't have to pay attention. We came up to the monument, and I looked around. Not too much to see really, as the trees were close in on us. I took out my map and said, "Okay, we go this way." Just then, the guy with the radio said, "Well, I'm in charge of this group." I looked at him and said, "Okay, you're in charge." I put my map in my pocket and said, "Which way do we go?" He looked at me and asked if he could see the map. And so I asked him, "You don't have a map. How are you going to lead us?" He looked a little dumbfounded and said, "Well, you have a map." I shook my head. "Let me enlighten you. You are not in charge. You're the radio operator. How old are you?" He sort of put his head down. 17. I knew he was young, but not that young. "Okay, you're probably not going to work." He just sort of shook his head and started with the radio check. At this point, I was beginning to wonder what we were going to do. I'd already had 2 children self-eliminate, and now suddenly, the guy with the radio thinks he's the one in charge. I looked up and said softly to the sky, "What's next?" So we head off, and it's not a bad drop down. A little steep here and there, but really no big deal. Then we get down to the bottom, and one of the guys is sucking wind like crazy. So I asked him what was wrong, and he's huffing and puffing so badly. I was wondering if maybe he was going to have a heart attack. He looked at me with sweat pouring off of him, and he told me that climb down was ungodly. Now I'm confused. We didn't have to climb anything. All we did was drop down, with gravity sort of helping us. I wasn't breathing hard and haven't even broken sweat, and this guy was clearly messed up. "Dude, tell me something. If you knew you weren't in any kind of shape to be doing a search for hikers, why are you here?" He looked at me like I was crazy. "Because my buddies were coming to help out." I just told him, "Well, this you just did is nothing. In just a bit, we have to climb. That means go up. You think you're sucking wind now. Gonna go against gravity will kill you." And he got a look of sudden realization on his face. "Why don't you go back to the parking lot and see if you can help them there, because you're just slowing us down." He looked up the mountain and back at me and said, "Back up there," and started shaking his head and got a very concerned look on his face. "I can't make it. Not by myself." And this was getting ridiculous. "I'm not going to carry you. We're supposed to be a 6-man team. When you leave, we're down to 3. That means we can't cover our search but half the ground we're supposed to cover because you shouldn't be here." The poor kid looked hurt, but honestly, he was exhausted from hiking down, and he was slowing us down, and he knew it. "All you have to do is climb right back up the way we came. You can't leave me here alone," he told me. I couldn't believe this. Not only was he out of shape, but now he was turning into a sissy. So I stopped him. "You aren't alone. You are 200 yards from the monument. There are people up there because that's where the guy who's relaying the radio communications for all the parties over here is located. It's a high point." "How do you know that?" he asked. "Because we covered all this in the meeting we had with the chief, and you had better known that had you been paying attention. But suffice to say that I ripped off a tirade of things better not repeated here in a highly agitated state. Upon finishing, Bubba decided he could find his way back to civilization on his own. No problem. Suddenly, he found a lot of strength and was going uphill like it wasn't a huge problem at all, so as long as he can get away from me. So, now I walked back over to the other two and tried to talk in a much calmer voice. Is there some problem or issue that you two might have that's going to prevent you from actually doing what we've come here to do?" The two of them just began shaking their heads. "Do either one of you have some injury? Or maybe you're just not up for the task. Either one of you got your period maybe. Or maybe you're sore." Then they were smiling. "Okay, let's go." We've spread out, but stayed within eyesight at all times. A couple of times I had to shout to get one of them back, but in all of our search, it was going well. We'd covered a couple of miles, and were taking a break. And of course, we were talking about what might have happened to the guy. And yes, this was long before the book, Missing 411, written by David Pilates. But it wasn't odd to have people disappear at all. One of the guys had asked if I'd ever been on a search and rescue before, and I told him I was a hiker, and there's sort of an understanding that when people are needed to search for hikers, others will stop what they're doing and help out. The guy asked me if it happens a lot, and I told him it happens more than I think most people realize, but it's not uncommon for somebody to have to take a 1 or 2 break and step off a trail, take care of business, and then start walking to where they thought the trail was, and suddenly realizing they're lost. They looked like they didn't believe me. Seriously, guys. Then, what happens is panic sets in. Sheer, unadulterated panic. Abject fear. The kind that happens to little kids when they get lost in a department store, and they look around and can't find their parents. Now, I could see I was making a connection with them, because most of us all have gotten lost in a store. And really, they aren't far from their mom or dad. They just panicked. Same thing happens with adults. I'll tell you a quick story. Back in the day, when I was a Boy Scout, I was out with a couple of guys who were training for their map reading and hiking merit badges. I already had mine, so I was going out with them. It was a simple overnighter, about 5 or 6 miles out camp, and come back the next day to the same location for one of the guys' dads to pick us up. So what happens is we're following this one guy's navigation, and all is well, until he looks around, says there should be an old cemetery here, checks his map, suddenly freaks out. He has the wrong map, and he panics. Just goes off the deep end. He suddenly starts running like mad, crying, screaming, a total mess. I see what's happened, and I see the other boy is like almost in a trance state. I tell him to stay there and don't move. I dropped my pack, take off my runner. The good news is he started getting hot and tired, and was dropping his gear and leaving a trail. I finally caught him and had to tackle him. He was fighting me. His eyes were completely glazed over. I seriously doubted that he'd have recognized his own mother at that moment. Finally, I had to punch him in the gut to get to break the panic. He coughed and everything, and finally I got him up, and we began walking back, picking up his gear as we went. We got back to the other boy who was coming out of the trance, and I told them both, we are not lost. I explained that what we do is go back to where we started, and they both said that wasn't where the dad was going to pick us up. I told them then, when we're overdue, the father would check the other place before he got worried, and the next day, we got out, and just before Dad got there, I told them there was no reason to worry, and we did not need to talk about it anymore. The guys just sort of looked at me and said being scared is a terrible thing, and panic will get you killed. It happens all the time. Right then, the radio began squawking, but we couldn't hear everything. So I told the guy to climb up higher and to see what he could find out. He kind of looked like he wasn't sure, and I said, "Do you need someone to go with you?" He didn't give any indication, just sort of looked up the mountain and back at me. I shook my head, told the other boy to go with him, but come right back here, where they got some news. In about 30 minutes, they're coming back all excited. They'd found one of the hikers alive, but he was not able to speak or tell them anything. "Okay, where'd they find him?" I'd asked, as I was taking out my map. He told me, and I found the approximate area, which was about 4 miles ahead of us. Chief said he wanted us to spread out and come down this little valley. He pointed to it. That made good sense because that's sort of a natural path, the mountains. "Okay, let's fan out, but stay in sight of each other at all times. Guys, pay attention to what's around you and to each other so we don't give them another reason to have to search for us." We began moving along the bottom, and it's pretty obvious that we really need more guys. And right now, I was wishing the guys I sent back were here now. But odds are, the guys who couldn't remember to bring their own gear, and the one guy whose idea of a heavy workout was sitting in front of video games. However, I took a second and said, "Fellows, I know it's just us, so really keep your eyes open and search as best as you can. But no matter what, keep in sight of each other at all times. If one of you wants to move over to check something, tell the other guy so he can ease toward you." They gave an okay sign, and back to it we went. We looked for about an hour, covered about a mile, maybe a little more. All of a sudden, I hear, "Hey, I got something here." Naturally, we collapsed into where he was, and sure enough, we had what appeared to be blood on the ground. Judging from the way the leaves were disturbed, something did happen here. I took up my map, located it as best I could. You have to remember that at this time, I didn't have a GPS locator. It was old-fashioned dead reckoning. The boy with the radio had said, "I need to call this in." I looked at him. "You're right, but let's make sure there isn't anything else for us to tell him." He looked at me funny, but this was 30 feet from almost a vertical wall. "Let's make a quick sweep and make a corner," and so we came around over and went around. First thing I noticed was a very distinct smell of a body. Not stinking, but if you hunt, you know what a kill smells like. I looked over at the guys and said, "You smell that?" They all nodded. We eased on around, and then one of the guys grabbed my arm, looking like he'd seen a ghost. I looked at him, saw him, then looked where he was looking, and saw what had shocked him. There on the ground was a severed head. All of a sudden, the first boy was about to heave, and I told him to go over there and let it go. Naturally, the radio guy comes over, sees it, and he starts heaving. I sent him over to puke with the other guy. I walked over and got a closer look. I was really glad the eyes were closed. That might have freaked me out. I looked around a bit and started to find clothing shreds and the rest of the body parts. I couldn't touch anything, but I really didn't have to. This guy's head and body had been completely deconstructed. Arms, legs, and head ripped pretty cleanly off the torso. Then the arms and legs were ripped apart at the knees and elbows, almost the way you'd cut up a chicken that you were getting ready to fry up for dinner. Then, I walked back over to where the guys were, about done heaving. Asked them how they were doing. Radio guy was getting better, and was actually helping the other boy. I forget their real names now, but the non-radio guy was still a bit white in the face, but was getting better. He looked at me. I ain't never seen anything like that. And I told him, "You never will again." Then I said to the radio guy, "Now you need to call this in." I looked at the other boy and said, "Can you go with him?" He nodded. "Okay, I'll stay here, but be sure that they understand there's no place for a helicopter to land. If they have to get people here quickly, they are going to have to do a rope insertion. Tell them I have a smoke marker, and when we hear their engines, I'll light it. That will mark us." He looked at me a little wild-eyed, with adrenaline, shook his head. "Okay, one more thing. Don't go into graphic detail on the radio. Just tell them we found a body, and they're going to need forensics." He looked at me like it was his job. "You don't want that stuff being broadcasted out over the radio. Everybody with a police scanner will be on the phone to the press. That won't help. It'll just add another layer of BS the chief is going to have to deal with." He looked at me and nodded. Then he and the other boy headed off. I watched them head up to the top of the mountain and just sort of started looking, about to see if I could locate anything else. And the more I looked at the crime scene, the more I was bewildered. It was obvious that whatever had gotten a hold of this fellow had simply ripped him up like a rag doll. Just took him apart at the joints, from what I could see. There was no obvious bite marks, no sign of consumption. Now I could touch anything and make a detailed inspection, but no bite marks. Then I noticed that I didn't see any claw marks either. I went over to the torso, and not a single claw mark or bite mark to be seen. I got to looking at the wounds and could tell whatever it was that got this boy had ripped him to pieces. The wounds weren't like nice clean cuts. They were like ripped off by something with great force and at great speed. I walked back over to the bloody mess we found at first, and I walked down the other way a bit. I hadn't looked down here because they found the head. As I looked around, I saw something lying on the ground up ahead. I walked up to it, saw it was a backpack, still buckled like it would have been on a person, but covered in blood. Okay, there's his backpack, I had thought. So I made my way back over there, sat down on a rock, and began trying to put it all together. I took out my thermos of coffee, poured it into the cup, took a sip. Still a nice temp. I just couldn't get my head around it. A bear would have left bite marks and wounds and claw marks, and would have most likely eaten the torso, internal organs and all. Bears don't care if it's a human or an animal. To them, we're just another meal. Then I got to thinking. The only thing that could have done this was a bear. But we only have black bear in this area, and this looked nothing like a bear attack. Bears will kill something and come back later to eat it. They really enjoy rotting meat, and will often kill something and let it sort of get ripe, then come and eat it later. But not one claw mark, and not a single tooth mark. Not only that, but sadly, I have seen bear attacks before on humans. This doesn't look like what I've seen in the past at all. It almost is like something big and strong got pissed off at this fellow, took out its wrath on him, tearing apart the thing and all the large joints, like it had to take the strength of a large, severely pissed off gorilla. Then, there's the backpack, 200 or 300 yards away, still hooked up like it was on the guy, covered in blood, no sign of tooth or claw. I remember I began feeling a little uncomfortable. Reaching down, took out my trusty .45 and racked the slide. While I was far from scared, I was uneasy. Felt better feeling I was more ready. I slid my pistol back into its holster, checked the safety. I didn't close the flap so I can draw and fire quickly if need be. I'm not normally skittish, but I have to admit, with the boy all ripped apart, and no clear idea of what did it, I just felt uncomfortable. I guess about 30 or so minutes later, the two guys came down all excited, and both of them talking at the same time, and each oblivious to the other talking. I told them, slow down, one at a time. They were still trying to talk over each other, and I finally got them to settle down. Chief said he's sending a whole team out here by helicopter. Then the other boy kicked in. He said it's going to be one of those military choppers from Fort Pickett or Langley. They're going to drop down by ropes, and they're going to bring all the gear. And Chief said They was going to pick us up and get us back so we could tell our story to him. The dude was so excited that I think if I had checked, he'd have been a had wood. Just wide-eyed excited. When they think they're close to us, they're going to call us on the radio, and that's when you need to set off the smoke. Got it, I said. Bless his heart. I don't think he's had this much excitement in his life. Okay, so how long before they get here? Radio guys spoke and said, Chief said it might be a couple of hours. They gotta get everything loaded and get here. And then they'll need to refuel in Roanoke. Honestly, I didn't think time could pass any slower, and these two guys were high as a kite from adrenaline. Have to admit, I might have been them at that age too. But we finally heard the distinct sound of a chopper, and I got out my smoker right as the radio came to life. Tell him we hear his engines, and we're popping red smoke to mark his best drop point. Radio guy was telling him, and set off my smoker, and watched a large plum of smoke come out of that thing, like it's nobody's business. Then, the helicopter parked over us. Down came the guys on ropes like professionals. Down came more guys, and then gear. Then the chopper moved, and another started dropping gear and more guys. It was a sight to behold. First guy came over and asked me where the body was. It was hard to hear him over the rotor and the helicopter. We took him over, showed him everything we'd found, and of course, he wanted to know if we'd touched anything. We told him no. Also told him where my two guys puked. They looked embarrassed, but better than getting tagged as a suspect. Then the choppers flew. I looked at him as the roar died down. That's better. Looks like we're walking out then. Nope, you guys get to fly out. They need to get refueled first. They started doing a proper sweep, as they had more people than we did, and we just got out of the way. Let them do their thing. In a bit, the guy came over again and said hello, and was coming back up. So get ready. They'll be here in about 20 minutes. Sure would be curious what it was that attacked that guy. I'd asked him. Oh, it's a bear attack, no question about it. I looked at him like he was crazy. Partner, I don't want to sound like I'm telling you to do your job, but I've seen bear attacks. This isn't a bear attack. He smiled, and I recall it was an odd one to me. Oh no, this is a bear attack. Almost textbook case. I looked at him and said, BS. That's not a bear attack, and we both know it. He kept on smiling. That's what it will be put down as, is what he said. Then he turned and walked off, and his large sergeant came over and said, Come over here, sir, and let's get you ready for extraction. The chopper came and flew us back to the building. This is where we'd all started from. The first person there was the chief. He took us inside and into where the offices were and introduced us to the county chief of police. He then took our statements. Actually, he gave us sheets of paper and pens and told us to write down our experience. The two boys with me were done in 20 minutes, and they only wrote like half a paragraph. Badly, really badly. I said to them, Guys, this looks like it was written by a 7th grader. You realize this is going to be seen by real agents and police. I have to admit I was shocked at how badly they had written it up. We get there, and he was dead, all over the place. I just shook my head and said, If you're good with that, then give them to the chief. I finished mine. It was 10 pages long. So I took and gave it to the chief. He read it over. He gave the other two back their statement and told them they need to do a better job of writing reports. Here, read this report. And he handed them mine. That's what a report is supposed to look like. Then he said to me, You live in Roanoke, right? I told him I did. All right, thank you for your help. You're free to go. But this is an ongoing investigation, so don't talk about anything you've seen. If you can, it'll land you in jail. I wrote everything about no teeth marks, no claw marks, no cut wounds, and he read it like it was in the sports page of the local newspaper. I took off my gear and started out toward my truck. I heard the chief call to me. He came out, walked to my truck, and he said, Do yourself a favor. Don't talk about this. Just trust me on this." I looked at him and said, "What are you guys covering up here? That is not a bear attack, and you know it. That's not a bear attack, and you know it. There are no bite wounds, and sure, no claw marks on that boy. He was torn apart by something strong. On top of that, if it was a bear, it would have eaten some of him." Chief just held up his hand. "Just take my word for it. And if it makes you feel any better, I could use a good man like you in the future if we have any more disappearances." I looked away and then back at him. "Fine. Call me if you want." I wrote down my number for him, handed it off. I watched the news the next morning, and I saw a quick blurb about how the missing hiker were found. One boy is in the hospital, and the other was found dead. No foul play is suspected. I have always had a very deep respect for native spirituality, and in all of my learning about different traditions and important figures, I never thought I could ever come into contact with a piece of it. I didn't even think that it was a possibility that these animals were shapeshifters of any sort, until very recently I was telling my brother about it, and he told me that it might be. I grew up in the central mountains of Idaho, in between several big mining towns from the late 1800s, and living here for most of my life. I know what the wildlife looks like, and I know what I would see in which time of year, except for a few encounters that I still can't complain. I was out early with my dad and my grandfather to go and find a scrap pile to get some firewood from. It was about 7 or 8 in the morning, and we're on a tiny dirt path, miles away from any house. As we're driving, we turn a corner to see an animal sitting in the middle of the road. I would say that it was the size of about a large dog, but hunched close to the ground, completely black. It had a long tail that dragged on the ground. Then we pulled up, and it turned to look at us and had a small head, with either small ears or no ears. I couldn't see anything specific. After it saw us, it hopped off the trail into the bushes on the side of the road. Believe me when I tell you this, I have never in my life seen an animal that looked like this. We were all confused. One other time, I was out riding my ATV at around sunset. I was by myself on some trails that I knew well. I decided to start exploring a bit and took a different path. Suddenly, it started to go up a steep hill with lots of washout. As I stopped to try and turn around, the scariest looking bird I have ever seen ran in front of me across the trail. There are a lot of wild chickens, turkeys, etc., but this was about the size of a chicken. But it almost appeared as if the body was backwards, or if it was standing straight up, looking very skinny, just not like a bird. I could not see any visible wings, but it did have a longer neck, and its head was bare, like a turkey, or a vulture's might be. I finished turning around and sped back home. I don't know much of the native tribes that would have inhabited this area long before the gold rush, but I do know that a lot of violence and death happened because of it, with the historical cemetery having well over 100 unmarked graves. If anyone might be able to confirm or deny my theory, I would really appreciate that. So this day started out with a phone call from my brother, who was asking to take a hike in the national forest outside of our town, and then to go spend the night out there, in hopes of doing a little fishing and roasting some marshmallows over a fire. It was me, my brother, his girlfriend, who I see as my loving little sister, so it was going to be a really nice night. We left town, headed to the woods pretty early that day, around 3 in the afternoon. We had gotten to our spot in the woods after 2 hours of riding around, trying to find the perfect spot to set up our tent. My brother, sister, and I decided to start the day with some fishing. We grabbed our rods and tackle box, headed for a little stream about a quarter mile from our spot. As we came close to the stream, we noticed this awful smell, kind of like rotting meat. When we came up to the river, we found the source of the smell, an abundance of dead fish, all around the edge of the stream, and had seen the water that had a nasty rust-colored tint to it. When we were done gagging at the sight and smell of what was in front of us, a huge sense of dread washed over with an uncomfortable feeling of being watched. My sister noticed, asked what was wrong. I played it off with a joke, suggesting we go make a fire and setting up tent. I shrugged it off, really not wanting to frighten her or anybody else. After another 30-minute hike, from the stream back to the campground, my brother and sister began collecting wood for the fire, while I began to set up the tent. I set the tent up around the same time they came back with enough wood to have a fire last quite a long while. We got the fire lit. I admit, it was a pretty darn good fire. We then decided to roast marshmallows. Before I could eat any, I had to take a leak. So I told them I was going to step into the woods for just a second to go pee. I walk about 30 feet in and began to relieve myself when I heard my sister say hello. Finding this extremely odd, I looked around and didn't see anything or anyone. So, naturally, I go back to do my business. As I was zipping up my zipper, I heard her say it again. Hey. Thinking they were pranking me, I rushed back to the campground to find them still roasting marshmallows over the fire. I kind of freaked out. I'd asked them if they were messing with me, to which they frowned, explained that they've been in the same spot since I went to the woods. Now I'm terrified. They saw how ghost-white I was, and asked me if everything was all right. I told them what I'd heard. They suggested we just go into the tent and go to bed early, so that's what we did. After already taking a while to fall asleep, I woke up in the middle of the night to some underbrush crunching just right outside our tent, and that horrible smell from earlier was back, worse than before. For fear of scaring the hell out of my brother and sister, I decided to not wake them up. As I sat there, shaking and sweating, I noticed the sound of twigs snapping, and it had stopped. I began to hear what I could swear was loud, raspy, heavy breathing, like something was trying to sniff out our tent. I quietly tried to lay back down, cover my ears so I couldn't hear the breathing anymore, and eventually, I fell back asleep. The next morning we woke up late, so we decided to start packing up our belongings and head home. When we got out of the tent, the first thing we noticed was our cooler was torn up and down, thrown upside down against a tree, with everything in it was strewn throughout the campsite. Another thing I noticed was when I was rolling the tent up, a ton of footprints, weird footprints that looked almost like normal, except for obvious claw marks above each toe. Once I spotted these, I hurried up, putting the tent in my truck, and got my brother, sister, and myself out of there as quick and safely as I could. As of yet, I haven't been back camping in any kind of woods, and I can't imagine coming across another one of these things. The following experience happened just a few years ago. The person I was dating at the time was Native, and invited me to go with them to their grandmother's house for Christmas. This being the first time I've ever been to a Native American reservation, I wasn't sure what to expect. I had a lot of ideas regarding what might be, as well as the what-ifs. Nevertheless, excited to go somewhere I had never been before. Most of my excitement was reserved towards learning more about the culture and the unique opportunity of visiting a reservation as an outsider. Because of this, I was also a bit nervous. What if I wasn't accepted? Would the people be welcoming, or would they be hostile towards my presence? Although these questions were lingering, most of my fears were quelled by the wonderful hospitality that I had been shown by both Grandma and the people I had the privilege to interact with, all while visiting. We left our house on Christmas Eve with our dog and began to make the journey, a 4-hour journey to Grandma's house. On the way, we saw a beautiful sunset scatter across the mountains. After traveling for about 3 hours, we find ourselves at the turnoff that leads to an hour-long drive on a desolate road that would eventually take us to our destination. While on this road, my significant other shared stories of dances and the polytheistic practices their tribe had. All of it fascinated me and left me asking more and more questions than I had ever imagined asking. And by the time we arrive at Grandma's house, it's dark and cold. As I begin to unpack the car, my significant other takes our dog a bit a ways from the house to go potty. By the time they get back, I have taken our bags inside, locked the car up for the night. We sit around the kitchen table, eating food, amazing food cooked by Grandma. We share stories and play a card game. After about an hour, we all say goodnight and get ready to turn in for bed. It's now 12 a.m. My significant other and I lay down, and I call our dog to the bed. A short time thereafter, we fall asleep, although I had forgotten to turn off the light next to the bed on the nightstand. Around 2, maybe 3 a.m., I woke up, having to use the restroom, and noticed that our dog was sitting, just looking at the door that led out to the small hallway. On the other side was the main door to the house. I called for her to come back to the bed. She was just putting her nose at the base of the bedroom, sniffing while scratching. Thinking that she too had to use the restroom, I walked up to the main house door, opened it, ushering her to go potty. She ended up just sitting there and staring. After trying to get her to go outside a few times, failing in my attempts, I closed the door, made my way to the kitchen to grab a glass of water. In the kitchen, there's a big window to the very right of the sink. That window overlooks the driveway to the house with a bit of light. It makes the driveway just barely visible at nighttime. As I reach to turn on the faucet, my head turns to the right to look outside. I see a dog sitting outside, staring into the house. Something was off about this dog. It was much larger than a typical large breed by 2 times. I began to get the chills, and internally said to myself, "Screw this." Grabbing my water, about to head back to bed, the dog gets up and begins to walk away. One thing that I might feel not to convey well is the way this dog walked. It seemed to walk very awkwardly and almost stiff. After making my way back to bed, falling asleep and waking up the next morning, while eating the breakfast that Grandma had made, I just nonchalantly asked to anyone listening at the table if the neighbors had an extra large dog. That's when Grandma began to ask questions, and my significant other began to look very concerned. Grandma immediately made a few phone calls, and after a bit of time had passed, a native priest and healer arrived at the house. They began to converse silently with Grandma. Thinking I must have done something wrong, my significant other joins my grandma in conversation. They all begin to look at me, talk more, and then the priest goes around the house with sage and cedar. The healer comes to talk with me and Grandma about my experience. My significant other disappears outside the house to gather raw meat. From what I can gather, I encountered something I should not have the previous night, and by my arrival, or an outsider, they had to make certain preparations to ensure our safety for the duration of my stay. After this visit, we visited many other times, I had no other weird experiences, but this particular experience left me chilled to the bone, and I'll live with it the rest of my life. I just can't get over how this dog behaved and how large it was. It all was just so strange. This morning marks my second encounter with something strange, so I decided to share it. Now, I'll just say this. I have no clue what this thing is, but both times I encounter these things, it's always while I'm driving. The creature itself is a massive coal-black wolf dog thing with red eye shine. First time I saw it, I was driving home from a late class. A big old hog raced across the road, causing me to slam on the brakes. I did avoid collision, and the pig quickly disappeared into a cornfield on the right side of the road. A second later, this massive canine bounds across the road in hot pursuit and disappears after it. I've lived my whole life here, and have never seen anything like that. That was in southern Georgia. This morning, I'm driving through Winder to get to work, and I see what I first thought were railway reflectors since I was driving alongside some tracks. But as I got closer, I see this big black dog thing sitting by the right side of the road, staring in my direction. I wouldn't have gotten a good look at it if the car behind didn't have those bright lights. I slowed down since I don't know if it's going to cross the road or just run over the tracks it was sitting beside. It just sat there, staring at us with that weird red eye shine. The thing is not small either. Sitting down, it could stare through my car's windows. Am I just being paranoid about a big black dog? Most dogs at least react to a car heading towards them at night, and this thing didn't even bother to move. Around a year ago, in May 2020, my parents were going on their annual trip to Florida with my 3 brothers for a week. My mother asked me if I could go by their house, feed the family dogs, or stay and house sit. And being the daughter I am, I told my mother I would just stay at their house to save on gas. Throughout the week at night, I would bring the 2 dogs inside to feel safer, since my parents live on a somewhat back road. Keep in mind, my parents' house is surrounded by trees, and there is a thick tree line separating their house from the 2 neighbors. Well, one night, while I was at the house alone, I called my best friend, Bailey, to come over and stay the night with me. We were going to do what 2 middle-aged 20-year-old females do when alone: play video games, watch movies, TikToks, and drink. While Bailey and I were in the kitchen, around 3 or 4 a.m., making homemade funnel cakes, the dogs kept moving around, staring at the glass kitchen door that led off to the back porch. I asked Bailey to let them out there so they could chill. We would have enough legroom while we were cooking. While we were eating our funnel cakes, we came across a TikTok about making homemade temporary tattoos with a printed picture and perfume. Now keep in mind, my parents have about 3.82 acres of land, so there is the family house, my father's 2-door garage workshop, and a large pole barn. Those 2 buildings are farther out near the tree line, so Bailey and I walk down to the workshop to go into my parents' work office. I punch in the code to the garage door, and we go inside, straight to the computer, and print out each other a picture of Kylo Ren to try and make into temporary tattoos for each other. Before I go any further, a little side note. My parents have security cameras all over their property, and inside the office is a television above the desk, showing all of the live footage from the cameras. So, while I was cutting out the tattoo for Bailey, she says, "What is that?" I stop cutting and look up at the cameras. At first, I didn't see anything except for a small figure in front of the pole barn. It looked like it was sniffing at the garage door. I shrugged it off, told her it was probably one of the many stray dogs that roamed around the area. Bailey nudged my arm quickly after I said that and pointed to the screen again, wanting to prove to her that it was just a stray dog. I stood up and looked closer to the screen. When I did, I saw the figure, but it didn't look like one of the small dogs. The creature was hunched over on all fours. Its arms were super thin and long, but pointing outwards from its chest, kind of like how you'd imagine the girl from The Exorcism to be when she crawled on all fours. It had no fur, and its skin looked tight on its body. When I tell you my inner white girl went to open the door to look at it, Bailey stopped me right then, and I grabbed the lock on the door. Looking back at the screen at the creature, it looked like it scratched at the door of the pole barn. I immediately said, "What is that?" And the creature turned its head straight, right at the camera, like it was the scene from The Office. When its head turned, I couldn't make out clear facial features, but it looked like it had a human head, with two big glowing eyes. Bailey and I screamed, and it bolted. I mean, it bolted off screen. Clearly freaked out, Bailey and I hugged each other, as if that would protect us. Then, something smashed against the garage door. Not once, but twice. Like you know what it sounds like for somebody to smack a garage door from the outside with their hand. Yeah, just like that. I called my grandmother, told her that we thought we saw something, and to stay on the phone with us until we ran into the house. Once we got into the house, we brought the dogs in, locked every single door, and took shots of Crown Royal until we fell asleep. Now, we talked about this a few times, and I think it was a Wendigo, but Bailey's convinced it was a Skinwalker. We live in Georgia. I didn't think they were near here. Could anybody help us? This just happened. On Tuesday, February 16th, I was lying in bed around midnight. At the time, only my dad was home, but he was sleeping. I had been in my room for the past few hours watching a speed run, and nothing was out of the ordinary. I didn't have my headphones on at the time, so I could hear everything, and at that point, all I could sense was the video on my laptop. Well, shortly after the clock rolled over to tomorrow, this putrid, horrid, rotten, sulfuric stench filled the room. I instantly thought there was a backup in my house. I went all over the house, but as far as I could tell, the smell only came from my room, specifically by the windows overlooking the backyard. It was getting late, so I doused the room in air freshener and turned a fan on and went back to sleep. That night, Wednesday, February 17th, I'm in bed again. I should mention that when I'm in my bed, my back faces the backyard windows. Again, right around midnight, the smell returns. This time, though, there is scratching at my window. I turn to look, and the scratching stops. The smell is still there, though. I got dressed, went outside to see if an animal had somehow gotten up to my window. It isn't a second-story window, but it is still about 10 feet off the ground. There were no tracks, and the smell was even worse out there, and only existed right outside my window. I was more spooked than yesterday, but I decided it was one of my neighbor's garbage cans scraping against the chain-link fence. Then, we have last night, February 18th, Thursday. I'm in bed, and again, like clockwork, at midnight, the scratching and smells return. I'm dead tired from work, though, so this night, I don't even have the energy to look into what's causing it. So I fall asleep. While sleeping, I dream of my room. It wasn't sleep paralysis, as if I experienced that before. The smell was worse than it had ever been. I was nearly throwing up. Then, standing on my windowsill, was a creature that I had never seen before. It was like a deer, except it walked on its two hind legs. Its front two were tucked in, like how a dog acts when it wants a treat. It hopped along my windowsill. Its skin was brown and patchy. The eyes, though, were what caught my attention the most. They were like headlights. There were no pupils or anything, just beams of light. I found myself getting lost in them, as if entranced by them. I don't know how long I did, but eventually I mumbled a single word, Skinwalker, and everything disappeared and I woke up. No idea as to what is going to happen. I have a dream catcher that a professor gave me years ago. I might hang that over my bed. So, 2 things. First, the scratching returned last night, but there was no smell. I fell asleep around 11 p.m. Maybe I just wasn't awake to smell it. The scratching was what woke me up. Second, I spoke with the professor who had given me the dream catcher. He teaches a dream quest class and has contact within the Navajo community. He is at best a bit of a loss what happened, but wondered if my dreams could have melded into reality. The subject of the dreams being COVID-19, as I contracted it back in November. So, I am a bit spooked. I was driving in the woods at night with my father. I live in the middle of the forest, somewhat. We went down a long, dark road in Ontario, Canada, and suddenly saw a semi-low, tailless, earless, bony, and elongated creature that reminded me of the shape of a starving human mixed with a hairless dog. It was so fast, it was a blur, and it had long fingers and skin-colored pale flesh. Same night, we saw strange footprints outside our house. It was not recognizable as deer, moose, etc. We both have spent plenty of time in the woods, and could pretty well recognize tracks, and we never seen anything like these. It looked like a cloven hoof, mixed with a humanoid-shaped print, and was fairly spread out and large. The foot pattern was like a V shape, and followed across our yard in the snow, but suddenly stopped and left a gap of no prints, and continued again in the same line. We saw the same creature about a year ago, and we often hear deep growls that are so loud, they are as if a tree fell in the woods, and can be compared to a garbage disposal, layered with a high-pitched trumpet, with occasional clicking at our windows. My dad often sees glinting of gleaming eyes, and sudden movements of the same creature, followed by the same call. We do have native burial grounds and reserves in the city and area I live, and lots of sightings of odd, unexplainable things, including a place where thousands of natives were tortured and killed. This particular area, people report being pushed, hearing deep growls and screeches, scratching noises, weird glinting eyes, and getting disoriented by sounds, wind, movements, and even being pulled or separated with groups. People say the wind picks up and disorients, and they black out, somewhat as if they've lost time, separated from friends and waking up with it being pitch black at night. Anyone know what this is? A crawler, a skinwalker. I'm quite frightened. Thanks for any information or possible theories.